Hi everyone, I'm Neil Lawson, I'm the director of Compass, and I'm I'm absolutely delighted that Compass is hosting and publishing Phil's paper. It's a kind of natural stretch for Compass to begin to move into this direction. Ruth, as you'll hear from in a bit, who chairs Compass, has been practicing and talking about mindfulness for some time, so was really pleased. It fits very well with our kind of general good society, compassionate style of politics, and as we'll see, it fits very well with the kind of latest incarnation of our kind of 45-degree thinking. And how do we analyse politically and sociologically the flourishing of mindfulness? How do we begin to tip it in a kind of more radical social and political mindfulness, which is what the pamphlet's all about? How do we steer it away from a kind of just a consumerized, individualized form of DIY self-help? They're the kind of questions that we're going to be teasing out tonight. We're also going to be doing it again next Wednesday, and if you want more, because we've just got two of the authors here tonight. The other author is going to appear on a Livingmaps event next Wednesday, the 24th, between 6:30 and 8, and the details of that will be in the chat room. And Phil will be back then with, as I say, some of the other authors, and I think Francis from Compass is going to be chairing that conversation. We'll hear from each of the authors for about no more than 10 minutes each in just a second, and then we'll open it up to you. And opening it up to you means jumping into the chat box, which is at the bottom of the screen, and typing in there what question you have. And when we get to the questions, Grace from Compass will take over, and she will kind of pick people to come in, and we'll pick as many people as we can. So keep your contributions as short as possible, questions, so we can hear from as many of you as possible. So first and not least, Phil, and just an enormous thank you from Compass, Phil, for working on this project, for bringing these great authors together, for editing and compiling this publication, which we're delighted to be launching today. And I know something about all of your work with Livingmaps, which is hugely interesting. So tell us, in your own words, why you wanted to do this, what the overview is, what it means, and why should we be listening and reading the report?
Okay, right. Well, I thought perhaps I'd start with, in a way, give a bit of the background as to why we're doing this. I mean, way back in January, which in what now seems like a foreign country, where they do things differently. Way back in January, Eyeglass Books organised an event related to a book I'd just done, which is subtitled Towards an Ecology of Political Mindfulness. Ruth was on that panel, along with Valerie Walker-Dine and Dick Pounton, who are going to be speaking next Wednesday. And all three of them have developed their ideas further, really, in this new publication. Then we invited Angela Mcrobbie, a long-time friend of mine, and of course a well-known feminist writer, to write a short piece based on her experiences of being hospitalized with a very severe case of COVID-19. And then finally, we asked Mike Rustin to reflect on the new uncertainty principles we're all having to deal with. So that's the sort of the contents. But for me personally, the starting point in this journey goes back much further to the 1980s, the Kinnock years, when, having abolished the Young Socialists because it was controlled by the militant tendencies. I guess you'd have to be a bit long in the tooth to remember that particular moment. But anyway, the party launched an initiative called Labour Listens to Youth. And I was invited to give a talk to various constituency Labour parties about political listening. And actually, I talked about psychoanalysis as a particular form of attentiveness to what is often remains unspoken or repressed in most kinds of political discourse. And I wonder, there's one particular meeting, the audience listened politely enough, but never really engaged with the discussion. And afterwards, the chairperson came up and she apologized for the lack of response. And she said, well, we don't take much to Freud or psychoanalysis in the party, to be honest. All that stuff about dreams and fantasies. We're more concerned with the real world and how to change it materially for the better. So immediately it seems we have a problem here. There's a kind of a sort of history of economism, linked to notions of technological progress. It's all been part of the Labour Party's intellectual baggage. And I think, for example, it's prevented the party from moving beyond purely transactional modes of political education. You know, they just appeal to material self-interest as if that's going to get people on board. Then if we fast forward to 2020, it seems to me the same narrow view has informed the Labour Party's approach to the pandemic. It's been very good on the material inequalities in public health, which have obviously, come out so starkly. But implicitly, I think the party has adopted the same rational choice models as the nudge economists so beloved of the Tory party. It's a model which assumes that given proper health messaging based on scientific evidence, individual citizens are incentivized by material self-interest to make rational decisions about taking precautions. And therefore, they're ultimately responsible for their own health outcomes. Now, whatever you think about this model, unfortunately, in the real world, things don't work out like that. As the real relations of viral transmission, I mean, they still are shrouded in scientific doubt and uncertainties. Nobody really actually knows in detail. And until we have tracing and testing, we won't. And the public health messaging has become ever more complicated and confused. So in that situation, you get a set of imaginary relations of transmission organized around moral panics, which fix public attention and fear on particular pariah groups of carriers of the disease. And we've seen all sorts of evidence of that. So that seems to me to sort of belie the rational choice model. And I don't think the Labour Party is very well equipped to deal with, if you like, this other scene of the pandemic and how it complicates the picture in terms of how people actually respond to the situation. So this is where it seems to me a certain version of mindfulness comes in. And I think it comes in two modes. The first, which I'm going to call intensive, privileges the personal embodied dimension of experience. And the second, which I'm going to call extensive, focuses on the wider biopolitical context. One without the other gets us into trouble. It leads us either to depoliticize our experience, you know, it's all just about me, or it, on the other hand, leads to a kind of depersonalization of politics. It's all about machine politics, bureaucratic politics, governments by algorithm. So what do I mean by this intensive and extensive mindfulness? Well, COVID-19 certainly concentrates our minds wonderfully, but also anxiously on the body and our immediate tactile relationships with the physical environment and other people. In a way, I think the pandemic has turned us all into slightly hysterical materialists. But against that background, mindfulness, it seems to me, as a technique for concentrating our attention, perhaps through meditation, through other techniques, on inner states of mind and body and how they're connected, that's become an important element in the psychological survival kit for people on the pandemic front line. And it certainly does work, I think, in dealing with some states of anxiety, stress, and depression. It's a good antidote to moral panic. However, maybe we need to supplement that with a more psychoanalytic or psychodynamic approach to understanding the long-term impact on mental health and how we're going to address the likely epidemic of post-traumatic stress. And I think maybe Mike will have something more to say about a more psychoanalytically informed approach to that. So that's the intensive side. What about the extensive side? And by that, I mean the capacity to hold in mind the connections between different sites and practices and forms of power and inequality, but related to class, race, gender, and generation. How do we make connections between those concretely, imaginatively? Unless we do, it seems, there's a risk that political discourse degenerates into fairly mindless responses, manic knee-jerk activism, always iterating on one note. It's all about class and not about nothing else. Or the other sort of depressive extreme, it would lead to fatalism and defeatism. And certainly under present circumstances, you know, it's very easy to feel overwhelmed by the immensity of the tasks facing us. So I think political mindfulness for me is a balancing act. It's about cultivating a mindset that connects the intensive and extensive moments, not splitting them off from each other. And in fact, those connections are being made right now by hundreds of thousands of people across the world in the sudden upsurge of the pop protest against racism triggered by the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. So I can't breathe. I can't breathe. So these famous, now famous words uttered by Floyd with his last breath, practically, as the policeman crushed the life out of him with neon windpipe, that graphically evokes the horrendous physical symptoms of patients seriously ill with COVID and obviously struggling for their life and for their breath. It also expresses the profound sense of claustrophobia experienced by many people in lockdown. It speaks especially to the suffocation of so many hopes and aspirations within BAME communities, especially amongst the young people, by the relentless operation of what people have called the carceral state, a state which fails to give them proper education and job opportunities, throws them back on the hidden economy, and then jails them in disproportionate numbers. So that's another association that immediately comes to mind. And finally, the phrase conjures up the spectre of the environmental crisis and the negative impact of air pollution on public health. You know, the exponential rise in asthmatic conditions, which of course makes people more vulnerable to COVID. So these things are kind of all connected in that phrase. And I think that that's the kind of mindfulness. It's a very mindful phrase, and it's gone viral precisely because it does make those connections for people between instances that are often disconnected. And it combines them into a single powerful statement about the deep malaise of our society. So just to end on a more positive note, I Can't Breathe has mobilized tens of thousands of people in acts of joyful solidarity against the oppressive circumstances of their lives. The fight to breathe more freely, to breathe new democratic life into the body politic, against all the stifling structures of inequality. That, I think, is not only an important moment, but it also requires that we pause for thought. I mean, I think I don't know about all the other people here, but I mean, we're in the midst of this breathtaking pace of change. And I think there are moments when we need to get our second wind and, you know, to see where we're at and make the kinds of connections I'm talking about. And really this dossier, putting this together, has been trying to contribute at least to that part of the process.
Brilliant. That was fantastic, Phil. And to be honest, you made all those connections and I hadn't made all those connections in my mind. And you've done that for us. And I think you should take that bit and write about it and we'll publish it. But that, or we'll get someone else, help someone else to publish it. But those connections you made out of that I Can't Breathe, I've not read or seen before. So I think that was fantastically helpful to me. Over to Ruth Lister, Baroness Ruth Lister. And I think what you know, Phil's lined up is what Compass talks about, Ruth, all the time, is that kind of combinational politics when the biggest word is the smallest one, it's and that he's added another kind of intensive, extensive thing to our kind of 45-degree axis stuff, which I'm going to find really useful. But over to you and your contribution to the publication, Ruth. Thank you.
Right, unmute myself. Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Phil, for that introduction, which I think was really helpful. I just want to make we'll address 3 points in the piece I wrote for the publication. One is what I think is often a false dichotomy between mindfulness and collective political / social action. One is how we might think of Compass's 45-degree politics as a form of political mindfulness. And the third is what mindfulness might offer in the current difficult times. And I'd add another I Can't Breathe, because actually attention to the breath is absolutely central to the practice of mindfulness in terms of meditation. And so that's another dimension that helps knit together I Can't Breathe, because breath is so important. But start with the false dichotomy. I mean, some people are understandably skeptical about mindfulness in a political context, especially the kind of popularized, instrumentalist, what's sometimes called Mac mindfulness that Neil referred to, a kind of consumerist approach. And it's a common criticism and it was made at the meeting that Phil referred to, its focus on individual well-being, mental health, as being self-indulgent and as encouraging an individualistic view of change. And that's been addressed in a series of blogs on open democracy / transformation, which give examples of how mindfulness has in fact supported action for social and political change. And one perhaps obvious point, but it's one I make from bitter experience, is that if you're burned out, you're not much help to anybody else. So I don't think it's self-indulgent. And the inspirational civil rights activist Audre Lorde, speaking from a position of subjection to oppression, said that caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. But also, I would say that care of self and others can strengthen political and social action and enrich the social relations that are involved in such action. And mindfulness practitioners argue that it can help us observe and understand how our perceptions and reactions are conditioned by dominant narratives and ideologies, thereby helping us to break free from them. So on Compass, Compass doesn't, or certainly hasn't up till now, used the term political mindfulness, but I'd argue that in our emphasis on how we do politics, how we practice our politics, i.e. focus on means as much as on ends, and on trying to be the change we want to see in the world, which has been our kind of slogan from the word go, we are in fact trying to do politics mindfully. And an example is Sue Goss's call for the politics of the open tribe, which encourages us to be open to and learn from other progressive tribes and accept that no political party has a monopoly of political wisdom. And I think that was exemplified beautifully by Lisa Nandy's podcast yesterday evening, where the way she talked about politics was, she might not use the term herself, I think it was very mindful. And it's a politics of openness, kindness, compassion, generosity. It involves genuinely listening to others and curiosity about what they have to say and where they come from. And those are all qualities that mindfulness helps to cultivate. And I think the fate of Jeremy Corbyn's welcome promise of a kind of politics is a warning of what can happen when such aspirations are not underpinned by personal and organizational change of the kind that mindfulness encourages. Now, in Neil's pamphlet on 45-degree change, i.e., and those of you who aren't familiar with it, the politics that operates at the intersection of the vertical, more establishment form of politics and horizontal civil society, social movement politics, he emphasizes that we need to change not just the relationship between those two sides of politics, the vertical and the horizontal, but we also need to change ourselves, whichever side of that line we're on, and engage with each other, as he puts it, constructively and empathetically. And I would say both 45-degree politics and political mindfulness also bring to mind what some feminists have dubbed transversal politics, which is a willingness to stand in the other person's shoes and see the world from their perspective. And the term is used of rooting and shifting, i.e. you root yourself in your own values, but you're willing to shift some of your positions while staying rooted in those values, but in dialogue with the other. And there was a wonderful, the best example I know of this, certainly in the UK, is the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, and the work they did leading into the Good Friday Agreement was a wonderful example of that, from the two main communities in Northern Ireland, those women working together. Now finally on the current difficulties. We've been living through frightening and disorienting times. The world has been turned upside down for many of us. Different kinds of stress and anxiety depending on your own personal situation, which also reflecting the kind of deep structural intersecting inequalities that Phil talked about. For me, personally, mindfulness has helped enormously. That, well, probably both the both types that Phil talked about, but the intensive mindfulness. It's helped me focus on the now rather than worry about what's coming. And it's helped me, and I think a lot of people who wouldn't say they were practicing mindfulness, but a lot of people have talked about how they've seen things, they've heard the birds, they've seen the flowers or whatever in a way that is very mindful, and it can bring moments of joy. So, I mean, I think particularly there's a little wren that sits on my balcony, and it just belts its heart out, and I just feel joy listening to it, even when I've been feeling pretty grim otherwise. And going back to my first point, if we're able to deal with our anxieties with a degree of equilibrium and balance, and Phil talked about balance as well, I think it's more likely that we're able to feel compassion for and express solidarity with others who may be even in more, they may be in more vulnerable circumstances than we are. And as a contribution to transformation argued, we're better placed to open ourselves to the kind of transformation that the current crisis demands of us. One of the things we've been talking about in Compass is that actually we need to rethink some of the things that we've always said, and we need to be open to being challenged in that way, and to engage in listening and learning, which, as David Olusoga writes, Black Lives Matter calls for. And just to conclude, going back to Neil's 45-degree pamphlet, he lays down a challenge to think and act differently if we're serious about building a different sort of world. Now, I'm not arguing that Compass supporters should all, have to practice mindfulness in order to rise to that challenge, but I think mindfulness can act as a hinge between individual and collective change, either the sense of two kinds of mindfulness, bringing together and balancing the two kinds of mindfulness that Phil was talking about. So almost like another 45-degree axis, that politically and socially aware mindfulness can support and strengthen the work of Compass, and it can nourish us as individuals as we dig in deep for the long-term task of building a good society.
I'll unmute myself and say brilliant, so you can hear me saying brilliant. Thanks so much, Ruth. And we'll come on to Mike, but people start thinking about questions. I mean, there's loads in my mind, about how a politics of mindfulness comes up against a kind of a politics of instrumentalism, of brute force, of squashing opponents, and there's us, hugging trees, hugging each other, saying everyone's beautiful and fantastic and whatever. And where does that kind of sense of naivety come into that? How do the good people win? I think that's an eternal question for Compass and the people around Compass, or the people that Compass are around. But there are lots of other questions too. So start putting any questions in the chat thing. I've looked at who the participants are, and there's some fantastic people in the audience who I know have got a lot to say. So please start chipping in and asking questions. Michael, over to you. Thanks for being here, and look forward to hearing from you.
Well, when I was invited by Phil to contribute to this symposium, I was asked if I'd try to bring in a strategic perspective. And I responded by saying that this would be difficult. This is because of the uncertainties and complexities of the present situation. Strategies are about plans of action, but one can only have a plan of action if one knows the environment one is in, what is causally related to what, and especially what is most likely to happen next. Well, there are a great many uncertainties bearing on our situation. Perhaps the most immediate of these is located in the politics of the United States. It does seem that the outcome of the next presidential election will be a fateful one, not because a Democrat victory is likely to solve America and the world's problems, but because the re-election of Trump would seem certain to make every situation worse. Leon Trotsky's concept of combined and uneven development, which he used to explain the peculiar character and deformation of the Bolshevik Revolution, may be useful in understanding this Gramscian conjuncture of the pandemic. The virus seems to have originated in a market in which wild animals were caged, traded, and slaughtered in congested conditions, permitting a species crossover of the virus. The Chinese government now seems to have decided that such boundary breaches between the pre-modern and modern food environments are unsafe. But what happened in one place soon rapidly became, through the immense networks of human mobility, a global pandemic, spreading in months to virtually every part of the world. The COVID virus became a literal embodiment and metaphor for globalization. In doing so, the pandemic has disclosed many fault lines within the global system. These include the deep-seated inequalities which have left enormous populations of the poor defenseless against the disease. These divisions have been revealed to be highly racialized, and the effect of this has been that inequalities in regard to the virus have become linked in people's minds to other spheres of inequality. For example, through the death of George Floyd, to racialized policing. The inequalities of capacity of social systems have also been dramatically disclosed, with some well-organized societies able to contain the virus, more or less, while others have quite failed to do so. This is in some cases because of underdevelopment and poverty, and in others because of willful neglect by governments of their own systems of health and social protection. An ongoing geopolitical struggle, sometimes seen as the new Cold War, is also being illuminated by this crisis. Reaction by conservative nationalists in many countries, the USA, Brazil, and the UK, to the decline of their relative power has become a major source of division in the political order, both within and between nations. The withdrawal from global cooperation and regulation has been one response to decline from the political right, but a renewed awareness of the consequences of the European empires and resistance to taken for granted kinds of white supremacy has been a response from the left and the young. The contrasting imperatives of protecting lives and of safeguarding economic growth is also a significant line of division. The growth on which many modern economies depend is based on superficial notions of well-being, compared with the value of life itself. Is it really so vital to human well-being that international tourism and the hospitality industry continues at its previous scale? Would it be so difficult to imagine an economy based on different kinds of goods? How remarkable that a 22-year-old Premier League footballer from a black single-parented family has done more to address the issue of child poverty and hunger in the last couple of days than the entire political class. And of course, lurking in the background, temporarily displaced from sight, is the crisis of climate change and the immense difficulties being found in responding to that. Many different elements are interacting to one another in the conjuncture of the pandemic. What then of mindfulness and of more broadly psychological dimensions of this crisis? I'm personally more attached to the contribution which the psychoanalytic tradition makes to this understanding than to the discourse of mindfulness itself, although there are many overlapping concerns between them. What I find in a psychoanalytic perspective is its understanding of certain states of mind, both in individuals and in groups. These include conscious and unconscious anxieties, defenses against these anxieties, and the need for their containment, the presence of dispositions to hate and aggression, as well as to love and care in everyone, and the need for these to be in a positive balance, the projection of states of anxiety and weakness into others, and the role of this mechanism in racial and other forms of oppression, the existence of paranoid, schizoid, or persecutory states of mind, the importance of the capacity to mourn losses and to make reparation for injuries inflicted, and the emotional preconditions for thinking itself. These above are all ideas mainly located in the psychoanalytic tradition, following Freud, of Melanie Klein and Wilfred Bion. Recognition that the desire to know and understand is itself a fundamental drive is mainly due to Bion. It would be desirable if these ideas about unconscious mental processes could be fully integrated within social theory, but this gap has yet to be adequately bridged. It seems to me that practices of mindfulness are ways of seeking to minimize the destructive consequences of the states of anxiety which are brought about by fear, confusion, and indeed conflict. These are widespread in a conjuncture like the present, where people are beset by many dangers. The whole world is being turned upside down, to use a phrase that Ruth has just used, and not in the utopian way in which radicals have imagined times of social disruption in the past. The World Upside Down was the title of a book by the historian Christopher Hill about the diggers, ranters, and levellers of the 17th century. It seems to me that maintaining a capacity to think about the many meanings of this crisis and to understand its complex realities is now the precondition of productive responses to it. The ability to understand the crisis and the anxieties to which it is giving rise is itself in danger of being overwhelmed. We see this in the inadequate responses to the pandemic itself, which we've seen from some governments. The tribalisation of news sources and the injection of poisonous hatred and ignorance into public debates by some users of social media are instances of corruptions of the sphere of meaning and understanding. There is need for sustained efforts to understand this crisis, this state of crisis, and to promulgate feasible ways of resolving it. I think the Labour Party should already be devising a programme of national and international reconstruction with the aim of influencing the agendas of debate. I've argued that being in opposition is potentially an opportunity for a political party, as it might enable its members to escape from the limitations of parliamentary socialism, waiting for the next election, and create complementary roles for members as social activists and providers. A habit of mindfulness requires that we consider the implications of what we might desire for those others in this rather conservative society who do not think as we do. An example of this is in the deep continuities in Britain's attachment to the idea of empire, which seems to resurface in one form or another in every generation. For example, in the Suez Adventure, the Falklands War, the Iraq War, and in Brexit, and in a virtual national obsession with the memory of the Second World War. This deep identification with an imagined triumphant past seems to me to be too deeply embedded in the national psyche for it to be simply purged or expunged from memory. Instead, what may be needed is a prolonged interrogation of the many meanings of that history as they are present in virtually all of the nation's culture. Catherine's Hall Legacies of British Slavery project is an example of what can be done. In its documentation online of all those people and places to whom compensation was paid when British slavery was abolished by law in 1834. This project has enabled the involvement and complicity of large swathes of British society in slavery to be mapped, but has left people to come to their own reckoning with this. I would like to see online dictionaries of street names prepared for every borough in the United Kingdom, so that people could readily learn the meanings not only of the statues which stare down on them, but also of the reason why streets and buildings have been given the names that they had. This would be to encourage a kind of mindfulness about the past in the present, and might help us to move psychologically and socially into different spaces.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Mike. And I think the uncertainty and the complexity that you talked about at the beginning is something that's here to stay. I don't think there is any, settled landscape before us of which we can plan and strategize in the old way and predict in that kind of linear fashion. So therefore, the ability to be agile, to be flexible, to form alliances quickly, fluidly, etc., are going to be a defining element of a successful politics of the now and the future. And therefore, what kind of minds are going to be able to do that fast, fluid, agile form of politics seems to be the question. So I just wanted to kind of go around, quickly, because this is, the elephant in the room or whatever it is. But you've all got some attachment or some awareness of, because you've all spoken about it, of the British Labour Party. And when you've talked, each of you, in that kind of quite deep, complex, thoughtful, mindful, empathetic way, you feel a long way for me from the kind of mechanical, clunky, instrumental nature of the Labour Party. What signs or hope or elements are there that make you think at all that the Labour Party can shift to a politics that was even kind of, at all tangentially kind of mindful, socially mindful in its place? Ruth, do you want to go first?
I was afraid you'd ask me first,
Yeah.
Neil. I mean, it's very early to say, isn't it? I suppose, listening to Lisa yesterday, if the Labour Party were all like Lisa, then there wouldn't be a problem, would there? But it's not. But the fact that she has actually a rather important role in it now is a cause for hope. I don't know Keir well enough. I don't really know him personally, but he's put great premium on trying to heal divisions and that's clearly part of it. What I don't know is how open he would be to this kind of thinking as being, this is a way of doing that, we have to be able to look beyond. I mean, you know, going back to Sue's thing about the open tribes, I mean, it's not just about, she was writing more, I think, about open tribes between Labour and other political parties, which is also part of it, but there are also very strong tribes within the Labour Party, antagonistic tribes. It's not clear yet to what extent I think those antagonisms will now be diffused. I don't think it'll be that easy at all. And I think this is partly, I mean, people may not know, but I'm a member of the, my sins, the inquiry panel that is looking at the leaking of the anti-Semitism report. And when Keir set up that panel, there's a threefold terms of reference, and the third part of it is to look at the culture, structure and processes of the party and make recommendations. And we're very clear that for us, that is the most important part of what we're going to be doing. And I think, I mean, you know, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn when I say I think we're all very aware of the importance of culture. And culture is partly about this, you know, what we're talking about here. How do we have, you know, if we can get to a culture which is, I would argue, true to the values of the Labour Party, and that, you know, wouldn't necessarily label it mindful, but we're talking about that kind of way of doing politics, of listening to other people, of being respectful of other people's views, of looking for the best in other people. I mean, recognizing what I think it was Mike who said, just we've all got within us the sort of, I mean, I can see it in myself as well, you know, doing mindfulness doesn't make you some kind of saint. You know, you can be selfish, you can be, you know, wanting to get your own way, you can be dismissive of other people, but trying to keep, you know, observing that in yourself, which I think mindfulness helps you do, not allowing that to then dominate the way you act towards others, I think would be very helpful. So I don't know. I mean, I think we have to, this is a key moment in so many ways, isn't it? We've talked about it's a key moment for not just our country, but the world in a sense, that, and the whole kind of Build Back Better idea. Because of COVID, it's a key moment for the Labour Party, because if it can't transform itself now, I mean, I don't see what its future is really. But yes, I mean, I see someone just put out last night, Lisa spoke about the importance of listening to people with whom one disagrees, and that's absolutely central, you know, key. Listening, genuinely listening, not pretending to listen and just waiting to come in with your point, which is what listening is often about. But genuinely listening, taking on board, trying to understand, going back to what I said about transversal politics, putting yourself in the shoes of the other, understand where they're coming from. If we can do politics in that way in the party, perhaps we can get away from that narrow instrumentalist, rather nasty, actually, politics that's been recently.
And obviously we have to recognise the context within which the Labour Party operates, which is an adversarial, competitive, winner-takes-all environment in which, you know, the people who play rough and dirty and aggressive, you know, tend to come out on top. Phil, do you think anything's changed since your meetings with the Young Socialists in the 1980s?
Well, I suppose a whole new generation of young people have come into the Labour Party. Some, but not all of them, in momentum, and they bring with them a different take on politics. And I think they're more liable to make these kind of connections between environmental politics, social justice, economic justice, and Black Lives Matter. So I think that's a hopeful sign. I just got two comments really. One is a very general one about the nature of our political culture, and particularly perhaps the political culture of the Labour Party. I think it's rather bipolar. It kind of oscillates between a kind of manic denial of what's going on. You know, I mean, Labour. You know, I actually went to a Compass conference in which quite a leading light in Labour councils actually said, well, we won the 2017 election. I thought, hang on a minute, you didn't. The Labour Party didn't. I mean, it did better than expected, but it didn't win. So this is kind of manic optimism, which is basically a denial of actually what's going on. And then the other side of that is kind of totally depressive position. Well, you know, it's all over. It's the end of socialism. There's no hope, whatever. So you get these kind of switches going on. And again, that's something which mindfulness, political mindfulness, I think, has to be very attentive to, and saying, hang on a minute. So let's just go back to Gramsci to finish that point. Okay, so you've got optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect. Well, I think probably optimism of the will is more a prerogative of youth, and pessimism of the intellect is perhaps more a prerogative of age. But you certainly need to, one needs to temper the other. That's Gramsci's point. There's a kind of, the two are in tension, but they need both to be there. And if one runs away, if optimism of the will runs away with a story, then you get, well, for example, current example would be the Exiteers. I call them the Exiteers because there's echoes there of the Brexiteers. You know, so we can go through lockdowns. You know, we can, you know, free up lockdown. The economy is going to take off. We're going to be back to business as usual. You know, once a month we get free. So that kind of mindless optimism, really, optimism of the will, which runs in the face of a lot of evidence. And then pessimism of the intellect. Well, I mean, the left's very good at sort of armchair theorizing, creating kind of utopias of the mind, but you know, and behind that is a kind of a deep pessimism of actually changing anything. So I think that these are the things we need to be more attentive of. And then just finally, just to go back to pick up a point of Mike's, I think what we need to be more aware of, what I call politics other scene, which is not about the unintended consequences of particular policies or political acts. It's about what Mike was talking about, kind of the more unconscious dimensions to the political plot. And there, I think, well, I'll give a concrete example. What should be the role of a shadow cabinet? Well, okay, at one level, it's literally shadowing its opposite numbers. It's trying to trip them up. It's trying to intervene, to show them up for failures that they're making and so on. Okay, we accept that. But what if it was also to be about looking at the more shadowy side of politics? You know, Jung's idea of the shadow, this kind of unacknowledged side of ourselves that surfaces in dreams, that surfaces in daydreams and so on, but we don't often acknowledge or make verbally explicit. Well, there's a lot of shadowy politics going on. And another example would be, for example, Dominic Cummings, and he, you know, how he features as this kind of shadowy figure, kind of manipulating, like a puppet master, manipulating Boris Johnson and so on. So I think a shadow cabinet needs to be aware of this other scene of politics, which is quite nasty, as Neil was saying. It's where lots of grudges are acted out. It's where lots of really unavowed desires are kind of enacted, where a lot of bullying goes on, where racism and sexism takes more and more covert forms. It's nasty. And it's in the shadows, and it needs the light of the public gaze, as Hannah Arendt put it, right? This other side of politics, this other scene of politics. So I think we need to be much more aware, much more mindful of that other side of the story.
Good. Mike, you've been a watcher of the Labour Party over many decades. I always find you a very kind of balanced, thoughtful kind of commentator on Labour, neither too hot nor too cold. How are you feeling at the moment in terms of this agenda? Unmute yourself, Mike. Michael, unmute yourself. Michael, can you hear me? Michael, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes. Okay.
Great.
I've always been very impressed with Paul Addison's book, The Road to 1945, where he pointed out that what happened after 1945 owed, I think he said, really more to activity and developments that were taking place outside the Labour Party, which the Labour Party then came to give some legislative action to, than to things that were internal to the Labour Party. And I've had one or two quite enjoyable discussions with John Cruddas about that idea. So I think that what we're about, especially with 4 years of opposition for the Labour Party in all probability. So winning power is not the immediate, legislative power is not the immediate option. How much can one change the agenda? How much can one create a different kind of hegemony about what kind of society people want to have, which probably all political parties will have to respond to. It's even possible the Tory party might have to respond to it if they get into a mess, but it might make a difference to the way the Labour Party manages to formulate its goals and aims. So I think one can pay too much attention to the mechanics of the Labour Party. I think the new setup, I think, is actually doing quite well, in the sense that I do think one does hear quite interesting statements by quite a lot of people from different political positions, which I think is quite positive. But more important for me than what's happening inside the Labour Party, with which I think there's a danger that Compass and the soft left before it can be too preoccupied, as if really getting control of the party is really the covert aim, even if we say it isn't. I don't think that's what's most important. I think what's most important is to create a different climate of discussion. And I also want to say that I think Neil's repudiation of the idea of a theoretical clarification, I think, is a mistake. I don't think I've ever been involved in a dogmatic notion of what's bound to happen, but I do think a theoretical interrogation of what is happening and why it's happening is absolutely fundamental. That was the achievement of Stuart Hall and his colleagues when they produced an analysis of Thatcherism. That also is an agenda that has to be continually pursued, and that requires a kind of mindfulness too, because it requires thinking about the complexities of these kinds of issues. It's interesting, just one final point, it is interesting, isn't it, that the initiative that's made the most difference in the last few days is by somebody who's completely outside the political structure, namely Marcus Radford, with interesting support from a politically rather savvy individual, also from a different world, namely Gary Lineker. I read an editorial, I think today or the other day, about welcoming the project to create a GCSE in natural history. Very, very interesting, because if that comes off, and the outline of it is very, very promising, what that would do is to enable a whole generation of kids to become interested actively in learning about the environment in ways which will overspill back into politics, even though it's obviously not going to be directly political in any kind of way. So that would be an example to me, like Catherine Hall's Legacy of Slavery project, of a kind of initiative, the kind of initiatives that progressive people ought to be involved with, which will interact with the Labour Party, and one hopes one will find people in the Labour Party who are interested in them, but which doesn't have to be primarily under the label of a political party.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Michael. Over to you, Grace, and some of the questions that are in the chat box. And as we discussed, not everyone needs to answer everything, and we'll come in for a final. I'll come back for the final round as we just approach 8 o'clock. Okay, over to you.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to just take the questions in the order they came in. Keep it simple. So, Steve and Stanley, you were the first in. If you can talk, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, I can try.
Yeah.
If you can hear me okay.
If you want to just read it out, that's fine as well.
I can, yeah, that's fine. So thanks everyone, really interesting talks. I think you all mentioned psychoanalysis, maybe Ruth was the only one not to, but it got me thinking about the history of psychoanalysis and its relation to meditation practices, especially Buddhism and Buddhist psychotherapies, but also that psychoanalysis is often combined with, especially Marxist, social critique, like you see in the Frankfurt School. And actually, it's quite common to see psychoanalysts being quite critical of the mindfulness field at the moment, because mindfulness tends to be understood through a mixture of cognitive behavioral therapy, positive psychology, happiness economics. So mindfulness practitioners tend not to see people, I would say, as being socially, culturally, or historically produced, but rather representing a kind of universal humanity. So, do the panel think psychoanalysis is a better carrier for mindfulness or not? And if they do, why? Thanks a lot.
Shall I reply to that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, two things. I mean, psychoanalysis as a practice, at least historically, has been in private practice, and it's a very lengthy and costly process as a private practice. Of course, it is also part of the public health offer, and perhaps has suffered to some extent by the growth of cognitive behavior therapy as a kind of cheaper, quicker fix for a whole range of kind of psychological conditions. You can see why the National Health Service has actually kind of gone for that and perhaps marginalised psychoanalysis to an extent. So that's one aspect of it. The other is, I suppose, I mean, people often criticize psychoanalysis. Well, Freud, for example, famously said that the aim of therapy was to transform extraordinary unhappiness into ordinary unhappiness. And basically, psychoanalysis has a rather tragic view of the human condition, as being actually very kind of conflicted, kind of individuals are kind of, traversed by all kinds of drives and desires. It's a pretty difficult business. Whereas mindfulness, and particularly the bit that kind of perhaps links up with both CBT and Buddhism, it has a much more positive side. It's all about looking at the positive side, having good dreams, not bad dreams. You can see why it's so attractive to people in, for example, in the happy clapping economy. I mean, let's get mindfulness in there, so all these people working in shitty jobs for lousy money can all feel great about it and be happy and smiley and nice to the customers. So you can see how it gets used that way. But I do think there is a fundamental difference in philosophy in a way that I think is not easy to resolve. And I don't know what Mike thinks about that. But there's also the practical thing that, for example, people working the front line in hospitals under enormous stress. They need something that literally to get them through the day. And I mean, long-term psychotherapy. I mean, it might come into play with the long aftermath, the afterblows of COVID-19, which will go on for a generation probably, affecting particularly kind of young people whose lives have been put on hold and who've maybe had really traumatic losses in their families. I mean, it's going to be an epidemic of a different kind. And I think it is something which psychoanalysis, if it was to be certainly given more space and resource within the public health system, could well address.
Thanks, Phil. Mike and Ruth, did you have anything to add, or do you want to move on to the next one?
I just want to say two things. One is that I don't want to get into an argument about mindfulness at all, and that's mainly because I do trust Ruth's own experience of it. There are many different varieties and forms of psychological, psychosocial involvement. Psychoanalysis itself has many different forms, and I dare say mindfulness does too. So I just think we should have a kind of tolerance of the different ways people find these things useful. The other thing I would say is that the area of psychoanalysis which I've been closest to is via the Tavistock Clinic, which has been an NHS clinic for 60 years or whatever, and whose goal has been to find ways of applying psychoanalytical practices and ways of understanding to enhancing and improving relationships between people and their relational environment at each stage of the life cycle, in early years, in schooling, in old age, and so forth. And that's been a progressive project since it's been trying to introduce a kind of broader, more emotionally enlightened aspect of welfare through attending to the unconscious difficulties that there are. It's an uphill struggle because the broader culture, as we've been talking about, is not very hospitable or sympathetic to those kinds of ways of thinking any more than it is to the ways in which Compass has been trying to address these issues. But one presses on and one survives, and maybe this can grow in its strength.
Just very quickly, I mean, and thank you for what you said, Mike. I appreciate that. I mean, it's true, there are different forms of mindfulness, and there's some which I recoil from, and but certainly, I mean, some of the practitioners who write in Transformation are very aware of the sort of socially, culturally, the way people are socially, culturally conditioned, and mindfulness is a way of kind of understanding that more in oneself. And one of the ways I've been getting through, because I live on my own, and I've been regularly taking part in Zoom mindfulness with thousands of people over the world, across the world. And the person teaching it, John Kabat-Zinn, is very aware of kind of these kinds of issues. And so politics comes into it. Talking about Black Lives Matter and so forth. So for me, because as I say in the paper, I mean, started meditating for a while in the 70s, and it was like two different worlds, my meditation world, my political world. And seeing how they can come together has been quite liberating for me, really. And then the other point I just wanted to make, which I think is relating part to what you said, although I don't feel as quick to talk about psychoanalysis at all. It's so many years that I've ever read any psychoanalysis, and I've been in therapy. But I've become, through my work on poverty, I've become very aware of the importance of the psychosocial, understanding how poverty is experienced. And I think social science has become, or some elements of social science have become more understanding of the importance of the psychosocial. And I think that's been a very important development in social science.
Okay. Okay, let's move on to the next question from Christopher Owens. You should be able to talk now, Christopher, if you're there.
Hello, yes. Lisa Nanzi talked about listening, and listening particularly to people with whom one disagrees, and also listening to people who didn't seem to engage with politics. You described vividly helping in a food bank anonymously, and people were astonished that she was a politician when she finally revealed it. And then she went on to talk about the good relations that she and the other two candidates had in the Labour Party leadership elections. And I thought that maybe her attitudes had spilt over into that relationship, and the other two candidates had caught something of that. So do the panel think that we stand any chance of that kind of leadership, that kind of listening attitude spreading through the Parliamentary Labour Party and into the membership? And of course, what do they think we can do about it? There's no use having an idea unless we've got some idea about what we can do. Thank you.
Thanks,
Well, I
Christopher.
come in on that. I'm really glad you asked that, because I think listening is, and I said a bit about this earlier, is so important. Somebody, I can't remember who it is, talked about listening as a responsibility of citizenship, particularly listening to, like Lisa was talking about, listening to people who may not be involved in politics, people whose voices are not normally heard. I thought it was quite interesting, Michael, I mean, you've been talking about Marcus Rashford, and he said how he had been listening to people who've been getting in touch with him about their struggles. He is someone who has listened and then helped bring those voices into sort of public debate. I think it's difficult to know. I mean, if certainly I think one has to lead by example. So Lisa does lead by example. I think it's interesting what you said about perhaps that then rubbed off on the other candidates. I mean, I went to a couple of the hustings they had here in Nottingham, and it was apparent, you know, the very good relationship between them, and you saw it also in the debates they had on TV. So if people can see how that, I think the very fact that leadership election was carried out in such a good-natured way, hopefully that will rub off, but we need more and more, I think, doing it by example. And perhaps there has, I mean, maybe at some point someone actually has to explicitly talking about how we do politics within the party and beyond the party, taking up Mike's point about, you know, we can't just be inward looking, it's how party relates to people outside the party as well, and genuinely listening to what people have to say, rather than just waiting to then tell them what you think, and then, you know, being changed perhaps by that listening.
Okay, Phil, I can see you waving.
Yeah. Yeah, well, listening, I mean, there are different traditions of listening. There's a psychoanalytical form of listening, there's the ethnographer's way of listening, and I think I'd like to make a pitch also for a rather really good and very topical book, but it's now out of print, by Rachel Pinney, called Creative Listening. Rachel Pinney was a very interesting person. She was a child psychotherapist, and she worked with a very famous child psychotherapist called Margaret Lowenfeld. And anyway, she worked with autistic children, and as you know, the thing about autistic people is that, you know, they find it difficult to pick up cues from other people in terms of, you know, people communicating what it is they're thinking and feeling about the relationship in the situation where they find themselves. So she developed this strategy of creative listening, which was to make people attentive to these more, if you like, silent cues. It could be body language, it could be inflections of speech, it could be particular words that people were using. And I think it would be an extremely good idea if members of Parliament and you know, people who are interested in you know, persuading people to their points of view politically should undertake a course of creative listening. I mean, you know, it wouldn't be entirely impossible to arrange, and also to draw on the experience of ethnographers and psychoanalysts in their different ways of this kind of attentive listening. And there's a lot in the current political culture within and outside the Labour Party, which I call megaphone politics. In other words, you listen to people who shout the loudest. And if people are not shouting, then they're not heard. So then beneath that, there's another sense in which you confuse voice and agency. So you say, well, if people haven't got a voice, then they have no agency. So the only way to get agency is to have voice, and the only way to get your voice heard is to shout. So you end up with a kind of megaphone politics. Well, if everyone's shouting, no one's listening. Okay? So there's two things to say about that. One is voice needs to be synchronized. I mean, woke, at the time when woke came, it was the collective voice of Black youth, right? And it was connected to a social movement, to Black Lives Matter. What then happened was something else. It became a kind of commercial thing. It got detached from a social movement. It became a style. It didn't have any political implications, and so on. That's what happened to woke. But I think we have to do two things, again, coming back to my initial idea of intensive and extensive mindfulness. One is how voices can be synchronized, and yet within that, how singular voices can still be heard and not be drowned out. Okay? So my model of that actually is not so much voice, it's jazz. If you think about jazz, you've got a situation where people are playing together, they're riffing off each other, they're improvising off each other. The whole thing is more than the sum of its parts, right? People can solo, but you know, within a frame. But in soloing, they also transform the frame. So I think jazz actually is a very good metaphor or model for the kind of dialogic form that mindfulness must take. And I think various other people here have said, mindfulness always involves some kind of dialogue, some kind of understanding of what where the other's coming from, taking that in, and then feeding it back out again. It's that kind of dialogic process. So, I mean, I'm just a jazz fan, but I mean, there are lots of other examples of that going on.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Let's very quickly, Michael, then we'll try and get another question so we can get through as many as possible.
Yeah, just briefly. I've been quite impressed so far with the tone of the contributions of the new Labour front bench. I've been impressed by the fact that people politically quite a long way apart, like Liz Kendall and Rebecca Long-Bailey, seem to have been found positions from which they can do good work in their own area, and that seems to me to be quite promising. What worries me more than about whether they can listen or not, and the business about megaphone diplomacy, is whether this political culture of the new Labour leadership is capable of generating enough interesting ideas to command the agenda. At the moment, the tone is all right, but at the moment the substance is in a way undeveloped. And I think they do have to be prepared to seize the agenda over a whole load of issues and areas in contact with people in civil society outside in order to command the discussion, so to speak. And I think it's possible to do that with people finding positions from which to do that which are politically quite different in their own area. So Liz Kendall, although quite conservative in Labour Party terms in previous terms, was quite effective on the issues of social care. Why wouldn't she be? So you could imagine people being found positions inside this whole ensemble whereby they can contribute to an ongoing, developed, multilateral political debate, which is about defining the future. That's what I hope to see.
Okay, thanks. Okay, the next question, Iski Gordon. Would you like to ask the question you wrote in the chat box? Can you hear us? Maybe not. Hang on, I'll try and unmute. If not, I'll read it out. No. Okay, I'll read out the
I think you just need to unmute.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, might be working now. No. Okay, I'll read it out loud. It's just to be quick. So the unions have a crucial role in the Labour Party, yet some unions do not seem to be able to have an outward look. They are so focused on labour and not work. What is the narrative that Compass should adopt towards the leaders or bureaucracy of the open unions to the current new reality? I don't know who would like to comment on that. Any thoughts?
Well, I suppose we'll begin with the public sector unions. So obviously, they're the only unions, but certainly the strongest. I'm sure that the experience of health workers and workers in, well, workers in care homes tend not to be unionized. It's one of the problems. But public health workers, having lived through, and some of them died as a result of this pandemic, will have a lot to say about the importance of public health. You know, well, in the dossier, our statement is public health is the true wealth of the nation. And I think this is backed up by a major shift in public attitudes to work. There's been a kind of transvaluation of labour values, and people suddenly realise that all these disregarded forms of work that are written off because they're manuals, they're apparently unskilled. In fact, they're often very skilled. They combine emotional labour, all forms of domestic labour, caring labour. I mean, next week we've got Lynn Siegel is going to be talking about that. But the labour of care, I think there's been a whole shift in public attitudes towards this, and that people in these jobs, in these frontline jobs, you know, are not properly remunerated. Their work is not valued. It's not valued in financial terms. It's not valued in moral terms, and yet they're central to maintaining the fabric of civil society. And I think the Labour Party is missing a trick if it doesn't see that there's a new political actor on the scene, one that hasn't actually got a collective voice as such, but it is what I call the hands-on working class, right? The people actually have got this hands-on role, whether in relation to the care of people or its teachers, you know, or people collect refuse collectors and so on, right? They go right, they break across the division between what's skilled and unskilled, what's mental and what's manual, right? It's a new political force. It has yet to find a collective voice. And if the Labour Party ever intends to gain some kind of electoral power with whatever alliances, it must create a platform which for this new political actor and actually address centrally their concerns. And unless they do so, then basically I think they just give up.
Okay, the next question then was from Maggie O'Neill. Let's try and get her on the line. Maggie, can you hear us and can you talk?
Hi, Grace. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, that's perfect. Go for it.
Great. Well, thank you very much. This is actually my first Compass event, I have to say, and it's been riveting. I really like the point Ruth makes about transversal feminist collaborations and co-productive ways, and you know, I understand that as effective material as well as collective. That we can contribute to conditions that support human well-being and critically address social pathologies. So this relational politics of care and listening is, it seems to me, a good model for transgressing the dichotomies that Ruth mentioned, but also connecting intensive and extensive mindfulness, if I've understood Phil's points correctly. My question is, as an academic, and kind of a long time in the university. How can we support this kind of politics from the university? And I'm thinking about pedagogy as well as research. I work in Ireland, and there's a kind of, it feels to me to be a kind of culture, but also there is a real kind of ethos of being a public servant. So kind of principles or values, of integrity and equity and fairness are really feel to be important. And so that's my question. What can we do? How can we support this kind of politics from the university?
Thank you, Maggie. Ruth, did you want to come in on that first?
Okay, hi Maggie. Unfortunately, I think universities are going in the opposite direction, and I have to say I'm not too unhappy that I'm no longer involved in the university on a day-to-day basis, because they're becoming much more, I mean, I might say more about that, but becoming much more bureaucratized, managerial, not, I think, providing the space for people to flourish in the way that perhaps they once did. Certainly here in the UK, I'm not sure about the Republic of Ireland, and whole sort of research assessment, or what used to be called research assessment exercise, REF now. I mean, it's all very, produce. And although there's a sort of emphasis on public engagement, I'm not sure it's quite in the sense that you're talking about it, Maggie. So, I think actually it's going to be a really tough time coming up, because with financial problems in universities, as I understand it, I mean, I just heard from one colleague, not enough for, in fact, another university, that there's going to be very little time for research, because they're going to have to be putting much more time into, well, I mean, it's good that you're putting time into teaching, but there's going to be far more constraints, I think, on people. So it makes it very difficult, I think, to do that kind of wider work that you're talking about. But I think it also, I think, makes it harder to operate in this kind of way within the university environment itself. It's how we behave with each other as colleagues. And that's the starting point, really. I think you can only start with where you are and then move out beyond that, whether you're in a university, you're in a political party, or whatever. And also, I think it has implications for how we do research. And one I think, positive development is certainly in social policy, is greater emphasis on participatory research involving the people that who are the subjects or the objects of research as subjects who have views about how that research should be done. And that, I think, is one path in terms of that we can be going down and trying to get more funding to do that kind of research.
Okay. Does anybody else want to? Phil, yeah, go on.
Very briefly, yeah. Well, if participatory action research was really pioneered by feminists, I think, and I think we all learnt from that. I think certainly the university I worked at, I mean, the vast majority of the academics got in their cars, drove to the university, did their work, and then left again, and had very little understanding or relationship of the kind of immediate community around the university itself. But I think, and I think that's getting, it is, as Ruth said, the sort of neoliberal university, makes it more difficult for people to do that work. Certainly at Livingmaps, we're a sort of network which brings together many young academics with activists and with artists, and we do community-based work, with groups that are facing particularly around issues of regeneration. So they're in the kind of front line of kind of social change. And we found that amongst the younger academics that there is a real desire to really engage in that kind of non-extractive, non-exploitative kind of research. So I'm quite encouraged in a way, despite all the pressures on them to produce, as Ruth says. A lot of them still do want to do it in a different way and challenge the kind of knowledge power relations that the neoliberal university reproduces.
Michael?
Well, I agree with what Ruth had to say, really. I just think there's an incredible loss of potential, missing potential in what you should expect from universities, given their enormous size, the numbers of students, the number of staff. These are huge institutions. They're like the monasteries of the Middle Ages. And yet, when you think what impact do they have, aside from specialist researchers giving advice to government on larger social and cultural debate, it seems to be very thin. It seems the kind of corporate makeover that these institutions have suffered in their own desperate competition for league tables, research money, etc., has hollowed them out. And it doesn't. You would hope that there would be some regeneration from inside the institutions, and Phil is talking about some items of that, which would make them more of a force for social regeneration in the larger society. Because I think it's been a period of significant decline. I mean, I'm more or less out of it now, but this is what I've been observing, really.
Okay, we've got time for one more from Richard Cooper. Hopefully, Richard will be able to talk now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, that's brilliant.
Hi. Yes, I'm just very keen for the panel to help to take it further and to try to think through the possible institutional forms that a different kind of politics could take, particularly within the Labour Party. I think of my CLP and its obsession with a winner-take-all philosophy. I'm in Keir's constituency. I don't see locally the kind of pluralism which Keir talks about nationally, and I wish I did. How can one translate any of the ideas of listening to others into new institutional forms? I suggested citizens' assemblies is something we should be exploring. I had experience 30 years ago now with citizens' juries, which were absolutely amazing in their transformative potential, but they found no resonance. How, in the kind of party the Labour Party is, can we transform the ways in which people are prepared to listen to each other? Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Phil, you look raring to go.
Well, Richard, I think, I'm sure you obviously know about this as well. People in the Labour Party and outside the Labour Party are beginning to rethink the notion of municipal socialism. That not the old municipal socialism was like, sort of enlightened people, the Fabians or whatever, had these kind of good ideas for improving life for the working classes, and then it came from the top down. And, there has been a whole shift now thinking that that's not the way to do it. And drawing actually on historical precedents. I mean, the whole tradition in the left, council communism, guild socialism, people like Tawney and GDH Cole and so on, who emphasized, worker self-management and extending that from the workplace to the community. And I mean, there has been quite a lot of movement, certainly in terms of people rethinking the whole notion of the state and what the state is for and how to democratize it. In terms of actual institutions, it seems to me that, well, to take up Mike's point in a way, we have to think about the sort of how political actors are networked, and the role that the Labour Party can maybe do in facilitating the creation of networks that they might involve Labour Party members, they might involve Green Party members, it might involve people who are not at all political, but have got a particular issue in the locality. And I think increasing numbers of people are thinking about not necessarily having to sort of just go down the communitarian road, because in itself communitarianism, I think, leads to a dead end. This is where, again, where Compass's 45-degree model, I think, is important. So, I mean, all I can think of my own experience, we're developing a Citizens Atlas of London, which is building a network of citizen mappers across 36 areas of London that are threatened by the London 2050 plan. And this involves, meeting people. It's very difficult now. We have to do it all online, but setting up kind of groups who are going to rewrite the history of their area, rethink about what their area means for them now and how they'd like the future of their area to be post-COVID in terms of a political settlement after the pandemic. I mean, it's a small example, but I mean, I think, I'm reasonably optimistic that people are beginning to rethink the way we do politics, and Compass is one example of that. But I think there are lots of others. If you look, and you mentioned citizens' assemblies, I think you'll find that, and all the mutual aid groups that flourished in the immediate onset of the pandemic, when it was clear that neither the state nor the market could deal with it. These mutual aid groups, sprung up overnight. Now, how can we build on that? And that's, I think, where we think about institutionalizing it. I'm not sure you can institutionalize it as such, but you can create infrastructures that help sustain and support it. So I think it's in that kind of area that we need to look.
I absolutely agree with all that, and I was going to say the same in terms of working on issues that matter to people locally with members of civil society, members of other political parties, although that can be seen as difficult sometimes. But if we don't, people will know. Compass was very much behind Progressive Alliance in the I can't remember the date now, not the
17.
One before. My sense of time has completely gone haywire. But if you've not been using the muscles of it, keeping them going, then it's very difficult suddenly to do it in an election. So I think the more that is really a really important part of the answer. But then also thinking of the Labour Party's own institutions. Can't we rethink how we have? I must admit, I don't go to many Labour Party meetings because I'm self-defined. But instead of Compass has changed the way it does meetings. It used to have speakers. We'd all sit there. We'd put up our hand, and if you were lucky, you might get and there was a very top-down. And then we changed that. We hardly ever have the speaker now, and there's much more thinking about how to mix people up, getting small groups, talking about things. Why can't we be doing that in local Labour Party meetings? Why can't we be having meetings where instead of a speaker or just going through the agenda and perhaps a speaker, actually having people in small groups talking about issues, listening to each other, and then thinking about how they might want to change the way the party operates, and then trying to build that up through the party. Think how we redo party conference. Again, I don't go to it, but can we do party conference in a different way? Thinking about our own institutions as well as how we work with others in the way that Phil talked about.
Do you want to quickly jump in, Mike?
I'm in no position to put forward any general recipe, which Richard seems to be suggesting we might do. But I just wonder how different Labour parties are from each other. I do know of one or two which are completely poisonous in the nature of the factional conflict which pervades everything that they do. But are they all like that? Are there no parties where people work in a different way with each other? I would have thought what one would be hoping to do would be to find practices that people are engaged with and extend and broaden them. There's another thing which came to my mind, which is that my daughter Susanna Rustin has a piece on the Sounding blog, which she's written about before, about a community council she set up with friends in North Westminster. It's one of the only community councils, basically an urban version of a parish council in London, which has a small rate precept, which has a ward kind of constituency of 5,000 or so voters, and which is able to do stuff like improve playgrounds and represent people on various kinds of issues. So what, in a way, she and her friends have done is to bypass the political apparatus in Westminster, which is a bit of a losing story, because although the Westminster Labour Party has given them support, it really has very, very little power in that borough, as you can understand. But they found a way of creating an organisation which can do, I would say, broadly speaking, progressive things. And she's rather strongly committed to the idea that creating another level of political activity in local authority zones might be a positive thing to do. The thing is, there must be lots of positive things to do, and it's a mistake to hope that there's going to be one size that we can simply decide on and promulgate.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Grace. I think that's absolutely right, that we have to embrace that complexity and all the richness and diversity of the things that are now springing up, examples like that in places across sectors. And the challenge which Phil has set us with this publication is how do we develop the mind muscles to deal with that complexity, that diversity, that fluidity. And I think that's been an amazing conversation. I'm really grateful for everyone who's dialed in to listen and to ask questions. I hope you got something out of that. Just to remind you that there'll be another session next week, and you can come into that, and that will be deeper and look at other areas. Phil will be back on that with some of his other co-authors. So if you'd like that, I think we've reached time. Phil, very quickly, incredibly quickly. I mean, where would you like to see this go, and how do you want us to develop this as a concept? What's next?
Right. Well, I think one step at a time is probably how I would take it. I mean, I think at least if you've done nothing else in this conversation, in this dialogue, and we are coming at it from slightly different points of view, is to indicate that we can certainly push and extend the notion of mindfulness, and that it opens up certain questions which have been historically ignored, not only by the Labour Party, but by politicians, particularly the political class. So I think we need to continue the dialogue. I can't say any more than that. Next week we're going to look at more substantive issues. This companion piece I've written looks at how the responses, government and popular responses to the pandemic, what they tell us about our society and culture. And we've got contributions also looking at the environmental crisis and the crisis of labourism, and then some discussants. Ash Sharma is going to speak about the Black Lives Matter and so on. So we're going to sort of focus down on more substantive areas, but still with a sort of in the back of our minds, the notion that this must feed into a continuing debate about political mindfulness.
Brilliant. And what you've done is open up a whole new dimension. I mean, we were kind of edging towards it, but you've really kind of pushed us into a whole new dimension of thinking, Phil. So thank you for that. You've also brought us jazz and poems, which are two other valuable contributions to the Compass Armoury. So thank you very much for that.
And some graphics.
And some graphics. Yeah, no, you've enriched us in all sorts of ways. But that was brilliant. I really enjoyed listening to that. I've learned a lot. It's made me thoughtful, much more thoughtful about this kind of area, and we will keep coming back to it. And this will now be a permanent element of Compass Politics. So thank you, Grace, for helping organise tonight. Thank you, Michael, Ruth, and especially to Phil, and thank you to everyone. Go and be mindful, peaceful, creative, caring, compassionate, ambitious, and all the things that we need to be in this era. Thank you for being part of this conversation, and we'll meet up again. Stay safe and stay well.